So I'll go ahead and start with the presentation. Thank you everybody for joining us today on behalf of the Network for Developing Conscious Communities. So today our webinar topic will be empowering Black communities through policy advocacy and sustainable development. And thank you for our speakers for joining us tonight. So I'll go over certain webinar rules. So this webinar will be recorded. We'll add the recording to our YouTube channel. Please make sure that your microphone is muted unless you're speaking. If you're invited to speak, please remember to unmute yourself and then mute once you're finished. And then you can also raise your hand for that function. If you have any other questions, you can also add them to the chat or the Q&A function through Zoom. If you're speaking or asking a question, please try to keep it brief to respect everyone's time. We also will be having the last 30 minutes from 7:30 to 8. And if we end the conversation early, the last portion will be just Q&A. So we will take questions throughout the discussion, but also we have a specific designated portion for questions. Please make sure not to record any part of the webinar without permission. We will, as I mentioned before, be adding the recording to the YouTube channel. For upcoming events, for the second part of the Conversations for Black Community Development webinar series, we have the Racial Equity, Restorative Justice in Black Community Development, which is on February 18, 2025, and that is the second part of our Black Community Development webinar series. This topic really focuses on advancing racial equity by addressing systemic racism and fostering justice in Black communities. And participants really explore strategies for combating structural inequities within critical areas such as housing, education, and employment. So we have this on February 18th. I'll make sure to share the link for that as well. And then in terms of our upcoming in-person workshops, we have Breaking Financial Barriers, which is on Friday, March 21st. We have The Power of Connections, Building Relationships for Growth and Opportunity, which is on Friday, April 25th. And we have Command the Room, Mastering Public Speaking and Networking, which is on Friday, May 30th, 2025. So these are the upcoming in-person workshops that we have. Then we also have the Black Co-opnomics Academy, which is a 12-week Baltimore hybrid academy focusing on Black co-opnomics. And that is really going over the history of the Black cooperative movement, looking at racial equity, how it impacts co-ops, developing co-op business plans, and legal structures of cooperatives. So it's a really interesting 12-week program that we have from March 6th to May 22nd, 2025. Then we also have the DC version of that as well, which is also the DC Black Co-opnomics Academy, and it's similarly going over the history of Black cooperatives and really the development of Black cooperatives. So those are the upcoming events that we have going on. I'll make sure to share the link in the chat as well, so you can look into that. So I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers for tonight. We have Lester Matthew Cuffey. He's a lifelong advocate for housing justice and community empowerment. He's a graduate of Phelps Vocational High School, the University of the District of Columbia, and the Antioch School of Law. He served as the legislative clerk for Councilmember Hilda Mason and as ANC1A Commissioner. Cuffey spearheaded key reforms in the District of Columbia, including the 2006 Rent Control Reform and the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act TOPA. He also led educational forums introducing financial literacy and coordinated the development of an affordable housing project called the Gateway Residence. We have Ryan Spack, who is a passionate advocate for Philadelphia neighborhoods, blending 15 years of experience in building maintenance, construction, and real estate development. He founded Project Rehab in 2011 through the University City District, transforming over 63 distressed properties into 175 plus residential and commercial units, adding $37 million plus in value. Ryan's community efforts earned him multiple preservation awards and leadership roles on local boards. He has worked to promote inclusionary housing and has done work in tenure tax abatement policies. As a mentor and national speaker, he shares innovative solutions for distressed properties. And we have Elijah Davis, who is a native of Mobile, Alabama. He's a community economic development practitioner, consultant, and researcher. He is also a co-founder of HANDS, a network working to preserve, enhance, and elevate historic Black neighborhoods and commercial districts by strengthening connections between people who serve them. In 2023, Elijah was named a Next City Vanguard, and in 2022 received Birmingham Business Journal 40 Under 40 Award. So I'm going to thank all of you for being here tonight and joining us in this insightful conversation. If there's something you would like to add to your bio that I might not have spoken on, you can go ahead and introduce yourself. Or I think you're muted, Lester. Okay, we can hear you.
We start off by saying my name is Lester Cuffey. I'm currently the executive director of the Coalition for Housing Justice, Inc. That's a local organization based here in Washington, D.C. Our specific goals include outreach to the community around tenant advocacy and education, as well as we also go into the community and sponsor forums around financial literacy, estate planning, uh, contact with other related groups, senior citizens, as it relates to issues regarding medical assistance and so forth. The Coalition for Housing Justice was founded somewhere around 2000, year 2000. It was made up of community activists, educators, uh, DC residents concerned about housing in general and concerned about economic parity and issues specifically in terms of protecting tenant rights and uh, and, and TOPA rights and combating housing displacement. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you for sharing that, Lester.
Mhm.
Elijah, Ryan, if you would want to add anything, or
Not at this time. I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Glad to be here.
thank you for being here. So we'll start off the conversation with really looking at the importance of policy advocacy and sustainable development. So I really want to get an idea of why you believe policy advocacy and sustainable development is important and what's the importance of that in Black community development. Elijah, do you want to go ahead and start a conversation off?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that there's a lot of sort of metaphorical language around grassroots and grass tops work. But the way that, I see the role of policy advocacy is that it's a critical environment for the seeds that the community plants and the things that they want, and sort of how we sort of support the seeds with the soil, the environment, all of that kind of stuff. It's really the atmosphere and conditions for growth. And so that's kind of how I see the role of policy advocacy. You might be able to plant a seed somewhere, but if it's in the wrong soil and the wrong conditions, then it's going to be difficult to grow. And that a lot of times policy sort of outlines the constraints of development ability. And so without sort of addressing sort of zoning, without addressing barriers to entry, without addressing discriminatory policies, then the seeds that we plant and co-plant with our neighbors often have a hard time growing properly and to their fullest extent. And so I think in my previous role, working in this beautiful neighborhood that I have behind me, and working in research, I think policy advocacy is a really important part of any toolkit of any sort of community-based sort of group and intermediary to be able to create a good environment for equitable and sustainable development.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, pretty much. I'm going to sort of piggyback on that. I think that when you talk about grassroots, you're really engaging, getting involved with developing communities that oftentimes are without the neighborhood grocery store. Communities that are oftentimes confronted with, use the term environmental racism. You know, the neighborhoods that are often marginalized, forgotten, neighborhoods when you talk about translating those neighborhoods into policy decisions made by the council, made by the mayor. These are communities that are often left out and forgotten, and so my experience being an activist is that I consider myself as someone that's been fortunate. I've been an activist 20 years or so of my life. I went on off to law school, and I went to a law school that Antioch School of Law. I went to a law school that pretty much said when much is given, much is expected. And so with that manner, I believe that we can, that you organize the community, engage the community, get out in the community, listen to the cries and the demands of the community, and try to translate that into policy, into legislation. All right, and in fact, I'm a native Washingtonian, so and I've seen it done. I've seen the power of the Black, brown, working class community at its best. You know, when I say at its best, I mean DC has DC in New York in the 80s and in the 70s. We were once called Chocolate City. And what that meant in many instances, we were the majority, but it also meant that, in a housing, specifically in the housing area, we had a very strong rent control law, and we had plenty of protections, for tenants. And we had a very strong, we had cooperatives, and we had, people were these. All of this was a byproduct of policy, a byproduct of activism. All right, and a byproduct of all the above. I referred to working class people, Black folks, brown folks, the left out, the shut out. All right, and you know and that was ushered in. Let me not forget that was really ushered in because by way of the civil rights movement, because a lot of the folks who fought discrimination in the South, who dismantled discrimination in the South, these same people came here, i.e. Marion Barry. Okay, and they challenged the discrimination here in this city, and they challenged the powers to be here in this city. All right, and what resulted in that is home rule. All right, and Black empowerment. So I've seen the best. Now we've taken a couple. I'm gonna say meaning the Black community, the African American community, the left out communities, the marginalized communities, the working class. We've taken a number of blows in the last 30 years. Okay, so we take a major blow. But again, I was taught that struggle is a dialectical process. Sometimes you can take one step backward in order to make two steps forward. So there's a dialectical struggle that goes on. You can't win all the battles. Sometimes you have to come back. Sometimes you have to lose a battle and come back and fight another day.
For sharing that, Lester. Ryan.
I'll add to that. As a real estate developer in Philadelphia, through conversations that we were having with our community in West Philadelphia, it became very apparent that the types of developments that we were seeking to bring out from distressed properties that we owned or lands that we acquired, that in order for us to ensure that those properties were made for those that were in the community, that made the community what it was, that made us want to be there in the first place, that we had to build to an inclusive rent price, that we had to make sure that those units were marketed directly to the folks that lived in that community. And we voluntarily did that for a very long while. And from that concept birthed this idea of inclusionary housing legislation, this zoning law in Philadelphia that allowed for a real estate developer to do some good and receive density bonuses for building to a specific AMI requirement and deed restricting those units for 50 years. And making that policy was, in my opinion, not the greatest mathematical decision that the city of Philadelphia ever made. However, the city council members that sponsored that legislation put forth a tool to build more middle income housing, and to do so without it costing the city of Philadelphia a single dollar out of its current budget. And to me, that was an indication of a government body listening to the community that more housing was needed at a certain price point and not having the dollars themselves to build it, and asking for the private development space to make up that difference and trying to incentivize that action without giving the development space a single dollar out of their own budget. And what we've come to find now today is that there's certain zoning overlay districts that umbrella certain regions in certain areas. And some of those overlays are now more restrictive than the original law. And what I mean by that is that they have demanded from the public space, from the public development space, more than what the original law had set forth. And now, because of economics, whether it's because of inflation, because of pressures on construction costs, whether it's interest rate environment, when you couple those policies with all of that math, it becomes impossible to build. And now those policies are actually harming the ability to build this middle income housing without the city subsidizing that process. And so we've come to find that that policy comes from the community, and usually comes from the right place. And if some way that community engagement and that conversation has an ability to bridge both the community's needs with the policy needs, with the mathematics around development, you have a very, very, very successful opportunity to build more housing at almost every economic level, except for the very top, which will get built regardless. And so, we continue to advocate for inclusionary housing in Philadelphia that actually mathematically makes sense and incentivizes private investment into middle income housing.
Sharing that. And then so to follow up with that, I would want to hear your idea of why it's important for building coalitions that center Black voices and their leadership for policy advocacy. Why is it important for there to be these coalitions and these grassroots organizations?
Gentlemen, may I? From my own experience?
Sure.
Today, I had the opportunity to visit two of my buildings. I had a new employee start today, and today was touring day. And one of the stories that I was telling them was at the lesson that this one particular building taught me, and that was that we bought a former warehouse that was zoned single family. So you had this massive 15,000 square foot building that sat on a residential block that was built significantly before the housing around it. You had this gorgeous brick facade. You had this vacant warehouse that was nothing more than a deteriorated eyesore for that particular community. And we had this glorious plan to partner with this nonprofit organization that temporarily housed senior veterans. And the idea was to build 18 one-bedroom, all handicap accessible apartments with an elevator in this building, and to privately fund the development, and the nonprofit was going to seek out VA HUD-VASH vouchers for the residents. It was, in our opinion, a win-win. And I was young, my career was just starting out, and I thought there can't be a single soul that believes that this is a bad idea. How could taking a vacant warehouse that's sitting on a residential block and turning it into 18 single one-bedroom apartments for senior veterans be something that a community wouldn't want? And we filed our zoning variance request, and we went in through the motions, and we failed miserably. It was, and the lesson that was taught that day, or over the course of 4 or 5 months, was that we never talked to the community beforehand. We filed this permit, regardless of whether it was a good idea or not, and went in with this, hey, aren't we doing some good for you all attitude. And it was such a visceral lesson for me at the very beginning of our career that it changed the trajectory of every project that we have done thus far. And we recently built a 57-unit building with 4 commercial spaces. The commercial spaces are all housing nonprofit organizations. Of the 57 apartments, 6 of them are deed restricted for affordable housing for the next 50 years. There's not a single cent of public money in this project. the project was by right. We didn't need zoning approval. We didn't need community approval or a zoning board approval. Yet we held a community meeting from the day we designed the building to the day we got our certificate of occupancy. Because what we learned was that the only way for that building to become part of that community was for us as the developer to engage that community from day one. And so building coalitions, whether it's at the city council level, whether it's at the community level, whether it's in the churches and the mosques and the synagogues, if you are building in a community, black, brown, white, purple, it doesn't matter. If you do not communicate from day one what your intentions are and mix them with the intentions of that community, your development will not be successful. It just won't be. And that has been seared into our mission as a company from the day that we failed at that warehouse and those 18 one-bedroom apartments never got built.
Man, Ryan, this is Lester Cuffy.
Yes,
Yeah, young man, you learn very well. You learned a lesson,
they
okay?
did teach me
And,
well. This is true.
but I too, I mean, my organization, was part of an effort and successful effort to put, to build $11 million affordable housing unit in far northeast DC. And the bottom line is that we had to respect the stakeholders out there. The
Yes.
stakeholders included the ANC, the Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner. It included the people that live in that neighborhood. What was there in that neighborhood prior to our development was quote unquote an undesirable house. I'll put it like that. Okay, with all kinds of undesirables, if you know what I mean. Okay, they've been there, but nevertheless that was there prior to what we wanted. And we had to go in, we, meaning the coalition and our partner, the principal partner, we had to go in, we had to meet the ANC commissioner, we had to meet the people in the community, we had to talk to the city council member, we had to meet the stakeholders in the community, educate them about what we're trying to do, make them aware of what we're trying to do, and build a bridge, come with a package. All right, we still have challenges, but grassroots organizing and building coalitions. Number one, it that the builds a trust. All right, with the stakeholders, and as a developer, as a community organizer. I go into places that people like, what are you doing here? Who are you? We got far southeast, far northeast. And so we have to build a trust and we have to educate people about what we're doing and the benefits thereof. All right. Let me make it clear. As a development that it could be a balancing. We can walk. We can all walk. Everybody. We can all dance. We can do both. In other words, it don't have to be, good guys over here, bad guys over here at each other. Okay. You know, as they say, gentrification has its benefits and has its, the negative side. But and it's a multi-billion-dollar elephant. Okay, but there are there are solutions, and we can build this bridge together if we coalesce, if we work together, if we educate the community, if we make each other aware, and be respectful to one another. Okay. So.
No, thank you both. I just want to briefly add, and I'll say something more philosophical and then tactical. A good friend of mine and colleague of mine, Carmen Mays, has a saying that community engagement is a business intelligence tool. And I think that's such a great summation of both the moral imperative to engage with our neighbors and sort of the tactical advantage. And some of the early work in engaging with business owners in the community, I remember we were doing surveys, and I was questioned by one business owner who could have been my grandfather's age about the usefulness of this. And I was, optimistic in saying this and that. He said to me, boy, that bank ain't gonna give me no money. And I had to pause and realize that he was old enough um, that 40 years ago, when he was my age, that he had probably an 800 plus credit score. I know that was before credit scores, but he had everything ducks in a row. He had his financials in order and was still denied for no other reason than because of who he was. And he still lives with that experience. And so, one of the things that we see in the literature is something called the trust gap. The Association for Enterprise Opportunity has written about this in their Tapestry report as being a barrier to entry. And so when we think about both the moral imperative that we're community economic development and not just sort of soulless economic developers, and that the differentiation is through process, but when we also think about the tactical pieces of our work that Ryan and Mr. Cuffey have talked about, I think that it's really important that we do it well and stay consistent. And so it's important to build coalitions because that is the best form of business intelligence, people that are closest to the issues and closest to transactions. I mean, we get really deep about this, but no company does market research for what passes sometimes as policy development, right? And so I think that's one piece of it. The other piece is that particularly you get your strongest, sort of outcome in messaging. I find with building coalitions from everywhere. And so I think I'm mindful that just because you may represent one space or one identity, that there are many people. And so I am very much of the belief that we've got to bring folks from the margins to the table, and a circular table at that. So I'm always mindful of that as well, being, a young Black man, when sisters do this work and lead this work, and often their voices are suppressed in other identities, right? And so I think that that's why it's important to build coalitions, because there's a moral imperative to say that if we are community economic developers, that our process must be different than top-down development. So that's just an integrity part, but then from a tactical part, it provides better policies, um, products, and really just cohesion and back end support. So it's really toward that.
Thank you for sharing that, Elijah. And to go off of what you said about the trust gap, what do you think are the best practices for maintaining the community trust and engagement throughout the entire process of policy advocacy?
Yeah, I'll start briefly. I think in my sort of work, we're working with business owners, and now is in research. I think Ryan and Mr. Cuffey talked about it really early here about announcing your intentions very clearly. And I think from a tactical space, I think one of the things that we have to fight for in organizations is the ability to build in the space for proper communication and engagement in our business models, right? A lot of times, a lot of decisions are made because, funders are not funding, a ramp up time to get to know the community, right? Or, we've got to make decisions now, and we bypass some steps, and so relationships take time. So I would say one is building into our business and operating models the fact that community engagement is not just something that's nice to do, it's something that's critical to do. And so as we're either waterfall planning or lean planning, asking for money or developing our operating models, we have to be able to build that in. And then secondly, the only thing I would offer would be to stay consistent. I went to that same older gentleman and business owner, and it was a small $10,000 grant that we received, which benefited him smallly. And I said, you know what? Thank you for doing that, because this is the result of that. And he laughed. Right. But it's about staying consistent And it's also about being available for critique. I remember, and still, as I walk this particular street now that I've moved on to a different space, this is like my family, right? And so they will tell me, or like, I don't like what you did, or where is this and where is that? And so the availability to be critiqued sort of strengthens trust over time. So I would say the availability to be critiqued, consistency both in actions and message, and then the ability to build into your operational model upfront communication and real engagement, I think are critical ways to begin to remediate the trust gap of the things that you can't control.
Can I piggyback off of Elijah? We don't receive public money or grants for the work that we do. But we have come to find that that in our business model, regardless of what we are looking to develop, if we do not ask the question of what do you want to see here, and start from that process, almost like a seed that's going to grow. Um, we come to find that our projects have failed in some way, shape, or form in the past. When when I walk into a room, especially in a community that has not seen development often, when we're building in Reading, Pennsylvania right now, for example, Reading has a very restrictive zoning code. It also has a population that has significantly grown in the last 10 years. They have a massive supply demand problem with their housing. There is a massive need for new units of every economic level in Reading. And one of the things that we came to find is that we walked into the room of a community that is 70% Latino, and had this conversation of, hey, we are outsiders. This is how the conversation started. We are not from here, but we have spent time in this community. We have come to find that there is a need for what we do, the product that we create. And this vacant building that's been here since 1931, which has been vacant for the last 5 years, was previously used in a way that you as a community didn't really love anyway. We're going to redevelop it. But before we finalize our plans, before we put permits together, we want to have a conversation with you about what you want to see here, what you're uncomfortable with. And what we came to find through that conversation, and this was not one meeting, this ended up taking over 5 months, 5 separate meetings over 5 months. What we came to find is that the idea of returning this building back to apartments, which is what it was developed for back in the 30s, was not the issue that the community had. The issue that they had was parking. And that the parking lot that came with this building only allowed for 12 cars. Well, knowing that, after the third meeting, we set our civil engineers out to redesign the parking lot. And we took something that had 12 spots and made it 21. And in the fourth meeting, the community said, well, that's great, but you want to put 38 units here. We feel like there's really not enough parking in this community to really understand and feel like if you add 38 units to this block, we're really going to have enough space for ourselves. And so we hired a separate traffic engineering firm to do a parking study, but not just of the block where this building was located, but of all surrounding blocks for a quarter mile over a 21-day period, so that the community could see what we thought we knew, but we had no justification for arguing, which was that there were 565 available spaces, and that under normal circumstances in the mornings, there usually was around 190 available, and at night there was about 235 available. And all that we really needed was about 17 to 20 to fill the gap for the amount of apartments that we had. And all of a sudden, you saw this kind of relaxation in the room in the fifth meeting. It became apparent that the information that the community sought out, a problem that they thought was there, was able to get resolved with information that I didn't even know to ask if I hadn't gone to the first 3 meetings. And so we've come to find, to Elijah's point, that if you put the community engagement in your business model up front and at the beginning, you will find solutions to a much better business model in the end. And what that meant for us was full support from the community for the zoning variance we need. And so we believe that every project should be handled this way. It is not that costly. It's just time and energy. And to me, if you don't have enough respect for the community you're developing and to spend some time and energy, well, then you probably shouldn't be building there.
Yeah.
Are you cutting off a little bit, Lester? Yeah, we can't hear you. Is everyone else able to hear him, or?
You hear me? Hear me?
Mhm.
Hear me, Ryan?
I can hear you now.
Okay.
Oh, I can't. Yeah, we can't hear you right now.
See something.
Yeah, I think maybe Lester, if you could rejoin. Until then, we'll circle back to you then.
Okay, wait a minute. Come out and then I'll rejoin, okay?
All right.
Okay.
Until then, we do have a question in the chat that came up, and it's how do you hold a developer to deliver on their intentional promises? We typically see promises being made for a benefit and community receiving less to none of the benefit. What is the process in analyzing these proposals as a community, to seek out the loopholes?
Trying to think about how we handled a project known as 5050 Baltimore Avenue, which was a building that we built in this inclusive model where there were deed restricted affordable housing units inside one development that was built without public dollars. The conversations that we had with the community resulted in a building that was double the density, double the size of what was allowed to be built by right on this particular site. And for the support of the community, we provided 3 of the 12 apartments, so 30%, well, 25% of the building as affordable housing. And the only thing that the community had, to be frank with you, was this community benefits agreement that, now that I think back on it, didn't have a lot of teeth to it in terms of the community's ability to hold our feet to the fire. We, however, were very committed to it. It was our idea to do it. And so I guess in our particular scenario, the community didn't have to worry about it very much. If I was advising a community today, negotiating that type of agreement, my advice would be that the deed restriction gets filed either at the same time that the zoning variance is put on the building, in preparation for the development in and of itself, or around the same time that support was put to paper by the community. Filing that deed restriction wouldn't stop the building permit process. It wouldn't harm financing in any way, shape, or form. It would be there, however, to hold the developer's feet to the fire if the building ever did get built. And if the developer were to sell that property, for example, before breaking ground, the next developer would be a party to that agreement because the deed restriction would exist. In the case of inclusionary housing zoning in Philadelphia, you can lose your rental license on the entire building if you fail to provide the inclusionary housing units properly. So if you have a building with 50 units in it, you have 5 deed restricted units, and you fail to provide one of the 5, the city of Philadelphia can pull your rental license. And in the city of Philadelphia, you can't collect rent, evict, you can't do very much without your rental license on that particular property. And so there's an ability to hold developers accountable if they are not as bought into that mission as, say, we are.
Thanks so much, Ryan. And thanks so much for the question. You know, and I'll speak briefly. Number one, this is a tough issue and will be even tougher, in the years to come. And I don't know that anyone has the complete answer on it, but I'll just highlight a few things. I think to Ryan's point, a lot of times you have CBAs, community benefits agreements, that are non-binding. And so don't have a lot of teeth, particularly in private, developments. Um, at the same token, you can do the work to try to find empathetic developers and empathetic capital on the front end. But here are, maybe a few things that I would say. Um, the one advantage of having public participation in deals, which really, there are only so many deals public money can truly support. And when I mean public, I mean more so local, money, is the ability to hold folks accountable through that, right? And so I think that's where sometimes the monitoring of deals becomes challenging. So, when it's time to claw back, incentives, folks need to, have some monitoring toward that. And that's a stakeholder thing to say, hey, we brought this, we work with the developer, but they're not holding up to their end of the deal. And, worse, they're not being communicative. So that's a thing where if you have public officials who are, you know, um, integrated into sort of the developments in their district or sort of their service area, I think having public participation that has clawbacks if folks don't do what they say they're going to do can be helpful. But that can also, to some people, create an anti-competitive or anti-development environment to some private investors, right? That's another piece. The second piece is going back to the first point, which is this is also the reason why coalition building is important. Because many Black communities do not have the economic power and influence to persuade, particularly some developers, and doing the right thing, in particularly in places. I think that's where the cross coalition building of not just people in your neighborhood, but and not just elected officials, but other business folks who want to see this as good for the environment. Being able to leverage that sort of social influence and soft power, if you will, is important. But third, I think there's a preventative space where this is where plugging into community planning is so important, and that through sort of overlays and sort of general master plans, you can pretty much get within the framework of things that are beneficial to the community. And that's why it's so important both to not just have participation, but community voices and leadership. And that's a key piece. So, to those points that Ryan laid out, just to recap, I mean, I think there's obviously the planning process and scrutinizing that, and then if there is public participation and local participation in the deal, making sure you're working with your officials to ensure. There have been a few um, there have been a few examples in some of my previous work and career where we never want to create the the notion of anti-development, but we do believe in the preservation of space and things that are good, right, do well and do right. And so there was a particular development that was quite frankly a storage unit that was just being built out of spite for a property. And we were able to sit down with that developer and explain to them the importance of reconsidering that notion. And he did actually. And so I think that it's tough. And that's something that we've got to go back on the toolkit with in terms of how we begin to address that. But I think building coalitions, having some sort of zoning support, and as Ryan said, restrictions, and then also making sure that you have some level of soft power, either through the business, financial, or political community is important.
Can I add one thing that I keep asking my political leaders why they don't do? And that is the question of I take great offense to political leaders who draft legislation, put forth legislation that penalizes or forces a particular action to be done instead of incentivizing the action that they would like. And so the city of Philadelphia, for example, wants more green roofs, right? They want more stormwater management done by private dollars. They want more bike lanes and more tree installation. In the city of Philadelphia, for example, in order to put more trees on your property when you're building a site, you have to put a significant amount of capital down as a deposit with the Parks and Recs department in Philadelphia. And it takes months to get your money back after you plant the tree. I understand why, right? There's actors out there who would never do it. And this way, if they don't do it, the Parks and Recs has their money and plants the tree on their behalf. I understand. I get it. However, there's zero incentive to plant that tree. None. And so if you believe in trees, if you believe in shading Black and brown communities because of heat protection and the environment, then you're going to plant them anyway, regardless of what the city law is and regulation. If you're ignorant to that, you just don't pay attention to that part of the space, there's no incentive for you to do it. There's just a penalty. And I don't understand that logic. And I would love there to be this line of communication from leadership and legislation that incentivizes the action that we want. If you want to build more middle income housing, then make the zoning easier to build more middle income housing. Make the permitting process a little cheaper if you're doing middle income housing. If you are building in certain areas that don't have development, and that's where you want to push the incentive, usually what you see is you see a relaxed zoning code. That's when legislation actually shows you what it wants. But it doesn't do it nuanced, and it doesn't do it in neighborhoods that are filled with persons that don't look like me. And I never understood that, and it always bothered the hell out of me.
Thank you very much. And then to go off of policy, what are certain key policies you think have historically supported or hindered the sustainable development of Black communities? And how can we work to create more sustainable policies that actually will help Black communities and
Yeah.
communities of color?
There's legislation in Pennsylvania right now called Act 58, which was passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the governor almost 4 years ago now at this point. It's a piece of legislation that allows for any taxing municipality to put a 10-year tax abatement on a real estate development, but only if that development builds 30% of their units as deed restricted affordable housing at 60% AMI or less for the next 50 years. If a developer chooses not to build the affordable units, they don't get the abatement. This is an action that allows for municipalities to leapfrog over something called the Uniformity Act in Pennsylvania. The Uniformity Act is a constitutional law in Pennsylvania that says, if I tax you one way, I have to tax everybody else the same way. And this particular legislation allows for municipalities to incentivize what I think is very, very, very solid development, another tool in the toolbox. Here it is 3.5 years later, and not a single municipality has passed this legislation to put it into effect. Not Philadelphia, not Pittsburgh, not Reading, not Bethlehem, no one. They talk a great deal about affordable housing at all levels, but no one's put this tool in the toolbox. And I would love to see this policy come into effect at a local level. I think that that's one that really incentivizes the type of development that we're all here to talk about.
Elijah, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that you know, obviously, just most people gathered here are familiar with, you know, hindrance. But I think just to briefly recap on hindrance, that I think often gets lost in discussion is that Black communities were specifically targeted for infrastructure projects, removal, all types of stuff, right? Over decades. And if the name of the game is accrual of resources, then the constant interruptions of accrual of land and property and, you know, other emergent properties that come with place-based development sort of continue to put you in that situation. And so I think that part of the tension, particularly as we move into this new legal environment, is that over the past 10 years, there's been more research to surface sort of the discreteness and the specificity of these policies against Black folks that were encoded. And so a lot of times, the way that Black development is discussed is as market failure, as opposed to injustice, right? And that's a discussion point, right? People pick up on the outcomes and the effects of intergenerational poverty, but really don't get to the root causes. And so I think one of the tensions that we've now got to brainstorm around is around the surfaced opportunity to um, you know, think about all the research that's been done, the public awareness of disruptions of Black main streets and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, think about what the role of reparative policy is and balance that with real life, you know, sort of incentives that folks can have. So that's the big picture. I think that the other challenge that Black neighborhoods and communities face is that 56 to 57% of the Black population is in the South. There is sort of the reverse Great Migration that's happening. And this is a place in which Dillon's rule really matters, right? So the lack of home rule, as Lester was talking about, in many southern states, really affects the ability to properly redevelop when you have heavy emphasis on, you know, property rights and all types of other restrictions. So that begins to color sort of a legal environment and a policy environment when you have traditionally sort of blue metros embedded in red states that are not only sort of conservative legally, but in some places antagonistic to urban centers, right? So that's important to name. So then the question is, where do you go, you know, from there, and where do you go from that, right? So I think that one of the opportunities, and I can pick up this more on the small business and where I've, you know, supported, is thinking about um, equity in processes, making processes more accessible and easy, or whether it be licensing, things of that nature, is really important. I can, you know, think about the revisions to food truck ordinances and things of that nature, all the innovations that we began to see during COVID in terms of adaptation and the use of public space. So that's important. And I know we go for some of the lofty things, but a lot of times the routine things, if you begin to uncover sort of barriers to entry, and it's not necessarily a lack of um, capacity, as always is said, sometimes it's just literally, onerous processes that prevent sort of adequate understanding and participation. So I think one streamlined sort of applications and processes for folks to do transactions and adequate information centers is a really important piece that helps enable just the overall better environment and ecosystem of development. And then two, I think that when you can sort of strike the balance of inclusion and incentivizing development, which is a difficult mix, where you are, that can be, really helpful. So I think those are two sort of broad-based starts that, of course, have to be adapted locally. But I think one of the things that the field has to brainstorm in this particular legal environment is that after a decade of trying to move toward reparative policy and getting a national pilot in the form of reconnecting communities, we're going to have to pivot a little bit more. And so that's nothing new, but it is just something to name.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I don't think Lester has joined. We're trying to get him back on the line. But until then, we another question would be, how can community land trusts, cooperatives, and other like alternative housing models really help to prevent displacement, and promote the long-term sustainability of housing?
Huh. I have one short answer. You have to find mechanisms that finance those type of ownership models. It's that simple. It's the money. The downside to co-ops is there's one or two banks nationally that look at co-op models as a structured financial safe investment, right? New York Co-op Bank is the largest of the ones that I can think of. Yet somehow, some way, there aren't more banks that fund co-op models. So that model doesn't exist that often because it's hard to finance. And so, land trusts are fantastic in theory, except who's the guarantor on the loan to develop whatever property is being developed within that land trust? And so the challenge ends up being that you have to fund through public dollars or through other economic means, whether it's just raising money through fundraising to buy a property and purposefully put it in the land trust. If there were banks, however, that finance that model, you would see that model increase across the country, all over the place, because it is a solid model. It's not the only model, but it is a very solid model, and it's one that should be used more often. It's almost it's not impossible. It's just incredibly difficult to finance. And as a result, it's very difficult to proliferate that model.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm not sure. I think I saw an attendee named Lester raise his hand. So I don't know if he's trying to get back into the panelist side. But to pick up on what Ryan said, but financing is important. And I definitely agree that there are a handful of even CDFI funders that have the in-house capacity to finance the model and maturity. However, within the past 5 years, we've been able to see a few shared and community ownership models that I'll touch on briefly, that as the field is maturing, give a great bit of hope to helping us solve that financing challenge without the overdependence on public resources. So one, I would just say that the biggest piece of why land trusts and ESOPs are important is, you know, um, yeah, I can see Lester is engaging in the chat, so I don't know if we can get him back on the panel side.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest opportunities that trusts and other things have is control community governance and control of the land. So we talk about sort of back end issues of developers and things of that nature, but being able to have land control gives you more, faith. Like that's it. The other sort of overarching piece before I get into some models that I think are very promising and have worked a little bit across the nation is really the following is that we have a silvering generation in which we're going to have a wealth transfer from boomers to whomever is under. And so you particularly in the space of legacy black owned businesses and other legacy businesses, it's important for us to brainstorm ways in which to pass down sort of not just legacy, but operations and value to the community, especially when many of these properties or spaces were acquired in environments that did not come from private financing or other traditional means, and so therefore take a different sort of exit strategy. So one thing I would say is that the Chicago Community Desk is pioneering a model of community investment vehicles, which is using sort of community crowdfunding and other sort of partnership models to really buy the block. And that's great. I would point to the Buy the Block Lab and Lanier Richardson in his work with Chicago Trend and developing and crowdfunding strip malls, which is an adaptation of what sort of the Portland Community Investment Trust has been doing. And then I think another innovation, sort of a mixture between a land trust and a land bank, is the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust in Richmond, Virginia, which has been able to sort of, blend the land bank and the land trust model, to really create affordable and attainable housing. And I think that's, really sort of, key to look at just a few of those models.
For sharing that. I think Lester left because I don't see him in the participants anymore. Maybe he will rejoin. But until then, we do have a question from someone, a follow-up question. I think they mentioned why is it difficult to fund? I'm assuming they're saying co-ops and community land trusts. Why
Yeah.
aren't banks financing if it is a solid model?
That's an incredibly fair question. The way that the banking environment works as it relates to real estate development is that there needs to be a guarantor of sorts. And that guarantor in most development cases is the main partner, anyone who owns 20% or more of that partnership. And so in the cases of the building that I'm sitting in right now, for example, my company was the main partner. We signed off and guaranteed the loan that helped build this building. And when we went to refinance this building, we guaranteed the permanent loan that was put on this building, meaning if there is a default of some kind, they can fall back on my personal balance sheet, my personal wealth. And they can come after not just the building in and of itself, but my personal assets. In a land trust, in a co-op, there isn't any party to guarantee that scenario. Most co-ops are made up of folks who don't have those type of assets. They don't have that type of balance sheet to be able to secure a full guarantor. Simultaneously, on the land trust model, most land trusts are set up one land trust for one property, most occasions. And the land trust in and of itself doesn't have enough assets to guarantee. Now, I say all of that, but there's an asterisk. There's like a caveat to that. There are CDFIs, there are community development financial institutions, these kind of semi-nonprofit banks that do provide some loans to these type of models. But the way that real estate development is normally done, the way that we see it collectively as community, the way that we see it become this prolific model in certain neighborhoods is done by the normal way of banking. And that normal way requires a guarantee. And that's usually really hard to do.
Yeah, and that's great, Ryan. And just to buttress that point, it's not just sort of the guarantee, but it's the underwriting cost to the traditional banker to underwrite like 20 people, right?
Right.
Which
That's fair
and
too.
a lot of loan officers, lazy is not the term I'm going to use. They are they like routine models, right?
Mhm.
That they've seen before and can and predict. But you know, to go a little bit sort of deeper in the question, I do think that um, there has to be some, and there is some tampering and innovation with the model itself, in terms of how do you deal with appreciation and rising building materials and costs. So that's something that, particularly in the last 10 years, has been something that folks have been trying to work. And I can put some things in the chat with just other models that are trying to at least examine that. But the other piece I just want to point it out is that there's a difference between an employer sort of ownership co-op and a consumer co-op, right? And sort of that difference is important. The other barrier to entry is not only sort of the when you get downstream into the financing, but the legal assistance to be able to structure such an entity, right? And so I think that's where folks are thinking about neighborhood real estate investment
Yeah.
trusts as an alternative to sort of the hard and fast co-op model with multiple owners. I've also seen folks think through what does it look like to have a partnership and a management team that then opens it up to a different, you know, sort of ownership down after it's set up. So that's a thing I think that's been debated within the field is what are the ways in which we can still adhere to a co-op model while sort of the financial industry is you know, maturing to catch up. And I think there was another question too.
To piggyback, Elijah, on that, we're actually working on a partnership with a co-op now that um, is in a space where they are out of capital. Their co-op model was built 80 years ago and never improved. It was never modified to today's time. And because of that, they economically cannot stay as a co-op. They cannot function any longer. And they only have enough operating revenue for another 7 months. And the model that we are now working on is one in which the co-op, which has this immense asset in the real estate that it owns, is bringing that real estate to a partnership where the co-op owners are going to become partners in the development in and of itself. And it will become a mixed income development where the co-op owners units are the deed restricted apartments and they get long-term leases at their current rents. And we are using our balance sheet and the commercial real estate banking market to restructure this property and this project. And so there are immensely creative ways that you can do this and do well and financially, do financially well and do communal good all at the same time. But to Elijah's point, bankers do like consistency and they like models that if they're going to put forth X amount of effort, it returns X amount of dollars. And so if you have a $500,000 home loan and a $200,000 home loan, it is the same amount of effort for a bank to underwrite. They would rather do the 500 all day, every day, because there's more capital to be made for the same amount of effort. And this is this is a challenge to that marketplace. It makes it very difficult for these models to be as successful as they could possibly be.
Right. And so I do want to put in, and put a few things. Thank you so much, Amal, for putting those in the chat. There are places over the past 5 years that have seen sort of both the gap in sort of models with longevity and both the need for more community control of their destiny. And so I just want to lift up that you have the Center for Community Ownership, And then there are a few other models. So one model is Chicago Community-Chicago, and they're pioneering community investment vehicles because, as we talked about, sort of the neighborhood real estate investment trust, Chicago Trend. And then also there's the Business Community Ownership Fund, which is sort of an interesting sort of development in which folks are preserving retail space, through, work with the CDFI and sort of, getting that mix together. So I would say that one of the assessments in thinking about cooperative models is understanding your financing environment and your legal environment, right? And that's usually a scan that doesn't come into place, and then figuring out how to just get the technical assistance and then the financing structure to be able to start one way and convert, or actually work with someone that has that. I hope that answers the questions. And then I think there's another question too.
Yeah, so they followed up saying, in theory, could a community incorporate to be guarantor and lend a portion of the personal assets to the incorporated entity to give it some weight?
The answer is yes, because you then become the guarantor. So you have to be incredibly confident that that land trust or that particular co-op will succeed, because your assets are the ones that will be at risk. Um, a community corporation or nonprofit, for example, that has a strong balance sheet could absolutely be the guarantor. The challenge is finding a bank and a financial institution that recognizes you as an organization that they can lend to, and also finding an organization that's not going to require you to be a partner in that deal. And what I mean by that is somebody who has managerial decisions. So let's assume it's a co-op, for example, and the co-op has 30 members in it. So the condo that is being turned from condominium association to co-op, you have 30 members. They don't have the ability to get the guarantor, and you as the nonprofit and corporation is going to put forth your assets to be a guarantor. If you don't have voting power inside that co-op as a member of the co-op, it's very possible that certain banks might not lend to you regardless of the assets you have, because you have no vote in what's happening inside that co-op. And so it's very possible that you would have to find the right banking partner for your scenario. And that's where the challenge lies. It's not that the model is impossible. It's that the way that the banking institutions are set up, the way that their models and products are set up, that's where the challenge lies. So you have to kind of fit what you're trying to do in your creativity to do affordable housing at any level. You have to fit that into their product base, not the other way around. And hopefully one day that changes and their products become more available to these type of models.
Elijah, would you like to add anything to that, or?
No, I think there's another question there.
Oh, okay. So I'm just gonna take one final question from the prompts, and then we'll start the Q&A. So So I'll get back to those questions. I'm just gonna take one more final question, then we'll start the Q&A. So to end the conversation off about sustainable development and empowering Black communities through policy advocacy, I think what all of us are sort of would like to hear are, what are examples of these communities, through your personal experiences, through the communities that you have worked in. What does a sustainable community look like to you in the ideal scenario?
Elijah, you want to take that one first, or do you want me to take that one first?
You go first and I'll close.
You got it. I like that. I believe that the most sustainable community is one that is completely and totally mixed. It is mixed income, mixed race, mixed religion. It is one that recognizes humanity at every economic level. I think that when you concentrate one particular economic class or one particular people in one particular place, not that they can't work beautifully together, but one of the reasons that I've always loved Southwest Philadelphia is that I have always found that although it was a predominantly African American community, there was every religion and every person that you could possibly find on this planet in a 1 mile radius. And I loved that. And I loved being a part of that community, both as a small business and as a resident. And I, from my personal experience, to me, that was the best type of community.
Yeah, I think that a community in which Black people are free to be is what I envision as a sustainable community in America. And that's one that is sort of free and unburdened from environmental racism, restrictive zoning, market restrictions, discrimination, things of that nature. And that's really a lofty vision. But I think incrementally, those things which just sort of unburden the business and development environment would be that and a vision, space. And I think that um, towards some examples, right? I think that particularly in the Black Wall Street imagination and awareness that's come over the past 4 to 5 years, that there is this want and need to, put that there is this one place that is emblematic of sort of a sustainable Black community. I don't know that we sit at that place now, that there is this one place, but there are certainly a collection of places and promising models that are endeavoring to not only preserve Black communities, but also ensure that they are prosperous. And, there are a few places that I'll talk about in terms of ways that they are particularly going through and thinking through how to make their community sustainable. So one of the things we've not talked about in depth in this particular panel and discussion has been sort of environmental impacts, both in remediation and building. And one of the models that I'll lift up in Chicago is sort of this planning effort out of Inglewood, which is on the south and west side of Chicago, called Grow Inglewood. That's the name of the organization, but they're developing the agro eco district that's very Black centered and thinks about the land and corridor development. So I think that's a innovative sort of piece. On another side of the spectrum, I think that seeing from a community engagement perspective what the Russell Place of Promise initiative has been able to do in Louisville. This initiative came on the heels of a choice grant and other grants and really concerns around displacement in one of the sort of key sectors of the Black community of Louisville. And this initiative has been able to really do deep community engagement and planning. So that's a place to borrow and model. And in terms of places that are actually building stuff, right? You have the historical places in which you have like the Dudley Square Trust, right? And then you have more contemporary models and what the Hill District CDC is working to endeavor. I think another sort of visionary space that people could look at in terms of future visions and future efforts is Destination Crenshaw in LA. And they are doing fantastic work in the Crenshaw neighborhood to revision sort of both public investment and space, both that is culturally centered, but really works to meet the current economic need. And so I think what, from the work that we sort of do at Hands, which is really gathering the field of practitioners, of folks who are focused on Black main streets and things nationwide, we're seeing sort of this momentous sort of push to revision, reimagine, and then also begin to think about new models of implementation, really sort of in the face and a mix of places. And so hopefully, I know those were a lot of different links and places, but I think together we're moving toward there. I don't know that is there yet, but I think with those things in goal, people have been able to take one piece of it, whether it be housing or public space or infrastructure or planning or business development, and really make some innovations really in the past 5 to 10 years. And those things should be lifted up because as we sort of understand those innovations, we can bring them back to our own neighborhoods.
Sharing those resources as well, Elijah. And then I think we'll go ahead and start with the Q&A. So I know we have a few questions in the Q&A as well. I think one question is how can concepts like social housing and land value recapture will affect Black-led development?
I can't speak to social housing necessarily. I don't have a great deal of experience in social housing, but land value I can certainly speak to. I I have development friends who grew up in this community in West Philadelphia who have lived here their entire life, who are now real estate developers themselves, who were in this community before gentrification took place, who was able to purchase properties at a much cheaper value than what you would purchase that land for today. They were able to utilize that value as equity towards their financing of development of those properties. And so they were able to capture the land value from the community in which they lived their entire lives and owned property in. They were able to capture that land value and utilize it to further their wealth and their development goals.
Elijah, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that this is, really a great question. I think that a few models or a few, sort of initiatives that I'll speak to briefly is sort of Kresge Foundation in Detroit and their social investments team has been sort of really forward thinking and thinking about how to provide not just program and mission related investments, but really sort of the high risk initial capital and guarantees, particularly them stepping up to do guarantees for projects that have helped bring, mainstream financiers to the table and other sort of community impact developments. And so I think that model that Kresge is forwarding, they've done it in Mary Grove, which is like near 6 Mile, is really important. So that's one piece. Also Robert Wood Johnson, foundation over the past, I guess, 2 to 3 years of which I'm aware of, has really been able to think through, its impact investments and try to do it toward housing. But one of the things that I would just note is that, we as folks who are on the ground need to save some time. And this is just, if there is a soapbox for me tonight, it is this: save some time to write and connect with people who can write and socialize the challenges from a deal level and a perspective. Because one of the things that we found in the George Floyd sort of how do we spend money is that there were a lot of folks that wanted to spend money, didn't really want to spend money or donate to causes, but folks didn't know how to invest or what that capital gap was, right? And so that's a really important piece in terms of engaging your local philanthropy. And unfortunately, going back to the original question around building coalitions, a lot of times in building coalitions, you've got to be able to develop education because sometimes if you're dealing with a local philanthropy who is a little bit maybe behind the ball in terms of this or has a perception that in a MRI or PRI is losing money, then that can be definitely a barrier. So that's one way, that we've begun to see sort of that. And of course, going back to land value capture as well, Detroit, from a public standpoint, is thinking about its land tax, and then going back to the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, more localized model with the land bank. They were able to use sort of a portion of the profits of the resale to one, keep it at an affordable AMI and to fund the building of new housing, which I thought was sort of really important. So I
That's
think that,
brilliant.
yeah. So, and I think, I'll make sure that that link is there. So
That's a brilliant model.
what they've been able to do, with that model at the Maggie Walker Land Trust, which again is like both the first land bank and land trust combined in that way, is being able to look at both that value, and that makes so much sense in the sense of dealing with sort of the appreciation challenges. And I think that the final point, that is that we're still very much unraveling sort of the HUD priorities with the new administration. We understand that opportunity zones will be prominent in that perspective, and that is, could be a challenge to how we traditionally think about development through the suite of new markets and light tech and things that have traditionally been there. And so that's something to really understand as we think about sort of HUD as being a piece and the assets. And so I think it's really important for us to not just build coalitions, but build out the models and the math so that we're ready to work with our city planners and developers around incentives and things that make sense for the neighborhoods that we love. So Lester, so glad that you are back.
Hear
Hopefully
me,
you can say
Elijah?
something. Yeah,
Can
we
you
can
hear
hear
me?
you now.
Hi,
Yes,
sir.
Oh,
How are
we've
you?
been missing you, man. We've been
no,
missing.
no, you
Yeah.
guys been, you guys, you guys been having so much fun.
Hopefully
But
that answered the questions in the chat before you get going, Mr. Covey. Hopefully that
I
answered.
think, Elijah, your answer was much more comprehensive than mine as it related to land value recapture.
Yeah, and I'll put some of those links in the chat. So
That's
please let
awesome.
me know
Thank
in
you.
the chat if those are good.
Thank you for adding
some of
those.
the questions. Sorry about that. I just had technical problems over here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Absolutely.
I had technical, I don't know what it is, but I'm here, I'm back. I'm here to take questions, so I'm respond to anybody. But I think Elijah and Ryan, I think they pretty much answered much of the questions. I do want to piggyback on the new administration. We don't know what's in we don't know what's in store. I do know that I believe the gentleman what is it, Tim Scott, representative from out of Texas. I don't think he's been. I did see the hearing, and there were a couple questions that were put to him by the by Senator Warnock from Atlanta, Georgia, and the questions involving upholding discrimination, upholding the laws, civil rights laws, and so forth. And Mr. Scott, he responded appropriately. It's just a question of whether or not whether or not he can handle all the other dynamics that come with the Trump administration. I'm not against public and private partnerships. I believe Elijah spoke of that, and specifically with low income tax credits. That's been a major achievement. I think as of today, a little over 3 million people have been housed through low income tax credits. Developers like Ryan and other individuals, partner with not-for-profit organizations, and we go through the process that Ryan and Elijah impounded upon. We go into the community, try to bring all the stakeholders together, and hopefully come up with affordable housing, with housing that meets the needs of working class people. Now constantly there are the dynamics that go on, but the latex programs is and has been a success. So we'll see. We shall see. It's easy. It's easy to when you're running for office, the rhetoric, the talk. The question now is governing. You have to govern now, and governing and campaigning is two different things. Two different things. Can you match the rhetoric with reality, with the reality of governing. So at this point, I'm not gonna, we can talk about Donald Trump and the Trump administration all day long. Bottom line is, he took the oath, and now he's quote unquote running the country. We shall see. We shall see. Okay.
I think there was another question. What role can philanthropy and nonprofit funders play in meaningful community-owned, controlled, created housing?
Yeah. I think just to say, yeah, it works. I mean, that goes back to something was talked about in terms of community, what is it? Community agreements. Community agreements. Community agreements. I think Elijah pointed this out. They're only as good as the stakeholders, uh, the local people, the community people, the politicians, and you have to have accountable politicians, politicians that are actually accountable to the community. Philanthropic endeavors, where those philanthropic endeavors can work. Habitat for Humanity, and there are other related groups. They can actually work, but still, you have to get out in the community. You have to talk to the constituents. You have to find out what the constituents want. I never make the mistake of thinking that I know and I have all the answers. Somebody that's out there, uh, homeless, living in the neighborhood, shelter to shelter, may have the answers. I mean, it was pointed out the answer might be the community needs more parking. Okay, the answer. I mean, usually, and Ryan pointed this out. Usually, there is resistance to development. Period. You're talking about going into the community. You're talking about changing the zoning variance. You're talking about adding additional housing. There's usually resistance, and there's rightful so resistance, whether it be from the philanthropic perspective or whether it be from developers like Ryan. There's usually resistance, and that resistance is a rightful so, because usually in the past, and in some instances, there have been promises that have not been kept. There have been developments that have virtually ruined communities. And so there's usually resistance. But while there's been resistance, there's also been some success stories. There have been success stories. As I pointed out earlier, no one really wants to live in a neighborhood you got to walk miles to get to a grocery store. No one really wants to live in a community where you have shady, unsavory activity in certain buildings that are vacant. Been vacant because the owners, some owners view vacant property as an opportunity, to write off for financial reasons. Vacant property sitting there, that that's still there, and the owners are reaping the benefits through equity and through tax write-off. So no one really in the community want to see that, because vacant buildings, unsavory conditions, communities that are lacking grocery stores, But as has been stated and pointed out over and over again, there's a method to this. Go into the community, talk to the people, listen to the people. Listen, if you have to meet, as Ryan pointed out, 5 times, meet with them. There's a thing called charrette, where you get all the stakeholders together, everybody. The guy that's living in a shelter may live in the very community that you're going into. Listen to him. You may agree to disagree, but once you put all that together and you put the investment together and you bring the philanthropists who want to invest, there's a real possibility that you may wind up with a successful project. And if you have a successful project, now you're meeting the needs of affordable housing. Because affordability, again, is a relative term. It's relative. Let's what's affordable to you may not be affordable to me. Right now in Washington, D.C., we have a serious problem with affordability, period. You know, a serious problem. Okay. And right now, I'm speaking from a Washingtonian perspective. For the last a little over 10 years now, we're gonna have to what do you call it? We're gonna have to reload, meaning we mean activists, lawyers, other individuals who are concerned about affordable housing and the affordability of living in DC. We may have to start all over again. Specifically, we may have to reelect. We may have to reelect a whole new crop of council members and a new mayor in order to bring about because in the last 20 years, uh, uh, we have lost. We have lost the issue when it comes to tenant protections, the rights of tenants. We have lost it. We have lost when it comes to affordable housing. A little over 40,000 people have left this city because of the lack of affordable housing. And 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 the mayor recently talked about she met her goal of 36,000 units. But according to a study that was introduced by the Institute on Policy Studies, homelessness in DC has increased. It has actually increased in the last 2 years. So there's a serious widening of economic gap here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Mr. Cuffey, for that. I think all of that is just, spot on. I think one of the things I wanted to briefly add in terms of the role of philanthropy, and I got at this a little bit earlier. I think philanthropy can be challenging and it is local. Not everyone has a Kresge, not everyone has major corporate philanthropic foundations that are, on the cutting edge of investment. But one of the things that you can do is the more that you can benchmark what other folks are doing, you can create a peer relationship with those foundation folks and begin to cross-pollinate ideas. So I think just as a brief space, I think one thing that we've been able to observe in our work across these different Black neighborhoods working to address these problems is one is that foundations can become an enabler of better models, right? One thing that is important is that our models are sustainable, and especially the as we see sort of the ping pong of administration pieces and that effect on corporate giving and things of that nature, it's important that we sort of build some sustainability within models. And so I think if you have a foundation that is able to enable model development, that's how sort of the Maggie Walker sort of piece that was just shared in the chat happened. That's important. If that's not available, one of the key things is understanding your capital stack and understanding sort of where they could be most helpful. And that's where, going back to the Robert Wood Johnson model, I understand these are very large. Yeah, I'm just bringing this up as models, uh, both with a guarantee, right? Two lenders and housing trust funds that helps enable the flow of more high cost of capital, and then also as investments into organizations. And so going back to the earlier question of Black-led coalition building, I think part of that strategy has to be building the case and building coalitions, because the other piece of this reality is that Urban Institute did a report and showed that most affordable housing and other community developers are white, right? Even though they're working in Black communities, this is a real problem. And so folks have been trying to, fix that through pipelining programs and other things. And we all understand that Black organizations have 75% less than net restricted assets as white organizations, and that most Black organizations operate under $500,000 a year. And so once you begin to understand that, you have to begin to make a case both nationally and regionally. So I think one is to enable the development of the model, two, being able to be a critical capital gap place, and then also being a convener of other capital. And I will just admit that this is very hard in conservative places, and understanding that we are 55 to 57% in the South now, because we are fleeing high housing prices in the Northeast and in the Midwest. We're also going into places that don't have home rule and are dealing with Dillon's rule and dealing with conservative foundations and blue states that are under scrutiny. And so these are things that we have to really pay attention to. I would say that the final piece that, in terms of social housing. So I'll let Mr. Cuffey and others who are there tell me what they actually think about it, right? It's always the folks there. But there have been some discussions, particularly when you think about models around Montgomery County and what they're attempting to do with social housing, what Atlanta is trying to do with social housing. But these are things that are very much in progress. What I would say is an opportunity is that we are in a housing crisis, right? And so the opportunity is that everyone needs to build more. We've got to have more home ownership. We've got to, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think this is the time to codify solutions and really sort of get the gaps, and show other people models of what larger foundations are doing, and they have not lost money. So hopefully that helps.
I'm going to say this about social housing. Okay, I think I mean, the concept, was here, was brought here to DC. I think there's a bill right now in committee that they've been, council has been trying to get out of committee. The concept is simple, as I understand, it's a European concept, but and I think Switzerland, a few other European countries, but that's in Switzerland. That's a whole different kind of thinking as it relates to housing. Okay, housing in the context of capitalism is a commodity. That's where that's where the problem is. That's where the dynamic is. Under capitalism, housing is viewed as a commodity to be exchanged and to be made a profit. Period. So and so to me, when we talk about social housing, okay, you mentioned land trusts. Land trusts, community land trusts is set up for the purposes primarily to keep land, entrusted to in a nonprofit for the benefit of the community. Co-ops are the same thing, as Ryan pointed out earlier. Well, the problem with co-ops is where you gonna get the capital from? Where you don't get the money from, because most lenders, are few, if any. All right. So now, some people have argued, okay, well, we here in DC, we create another government entity for social housing. Well, okay, that's another layer of government set up for that purpose. Well, there are different, in other words, there are different pros and cons about that whole concept. What I would love to see, and what many of us who are housing activists, what I would love to see is for the city council to enforce the tenant protections, the laws that are already on the book, strengthen rent control. It's a shell. The law's been sitting there, and it's weathering away. Strengthen this. Right now, any housing that's built in this city after 1975 is exempt from rent control. For the last 20 or 30 years, just do the math. Rents have gone up. All right. The landlords are making making profit on top of profit. Enforce the existing laws, protect the tenants, against rats and roaches and debilitating housing. Enforce them or strengthen the law. Strengthen the rights of the tenants. Make it feasible and possible for tenants to buy their buildings and go through TOPA and buy it. Okay, so there you have it, social housing. Do we need another? Some would argue, do we need another government agency set up to engineer social housing? I don't know. I don't think so. What I would like to see is the enforcement and the strengthening of the existing laws here in Washington, D.C., and some accountability from our elected officials. Because every 3 or 4 rounds, some of these elected officials do the same thing. Do you support housing? I support affordable housing. Okay, well, but affordable housing depends upon where you're building. If you're building it downtown, now you're talking about the median average income might be 60%. If you're building it, if you're building over there across Southeast, where the average income is 40,000 and below, well, the brother man who might, who might want to move downtown, he can't move downtown. The average income, the average housing down there is you're looking at, you gotta have an income of 100,000 or more. But what I'm saying is that the city council, the government here in Washington, D.C., need to protect the rights of tenants, strengthen the rights of tenants, make it possible for tenants to buy their housing, protect cooperatives, and not just that. Everybody in some instances don't want a home. All they want is a place to stay. So there might be some development for single occupant units. Okay, make whatever units livable and safe. That way, you begin to address the issue of homelessness in the city. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Lester. I know we're short on time, so we'll take one more final question, which I see in the Q&A. And then if you have any other questions, I'm sure whether Ryan, Elijah, or Lester, whether you would be comfortable sharing your contact information. If anyone has any questions, you could add that to the chat if you are comfortable. And then for the final question, in most Black communities, the only thing that leaders talk about is lower affordable housing, no mention about the other necessities of life as such. So if any of you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. I think that one of the quick stories I'll share is that most people have been reading about Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, and in Tulsa, and the story of that is actually quite fascinating. Where O.T. Gurley was so inspired by one of the first planned Black communities in the nation, the Greenwood neighborhood in Tuskegee, Alabama, and the mores of Booker T. Washington, that he sought out to very sort of do the same thing with the 40 acres that the government should have provided, and created a deed restriction for Black only, right? And so that created the community that is now populated our imagination. And of course, much has been lamented about, what is lost and sort of that pattern of peace. Something that has been, one of the things I love to discover about working in Birmingham and the civil rights in the Fourth Avenue Historic District, which you see behind me, is that this was a mixed income, mixed class, everybody place. And I think that when we talk about sort of Black Wall Street in concept, or it is an aspiration, what people are really saying is that Black folks had the ability to have, good development conditions, or not so much good, but just unmolested development conditions, right? Because of segregation, but it was also sort of a different tapestry of community, right? And so, in the same way that you would have a restaurateur and a barber next to one another, you would also have a doctor. In Durham, North Carolina, the founders of the largest financial services firm for many years, North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company, that was Black owned. The founders were a barber uh, and a brickmaker, right? And so I think that as we think about place-based development and economic mobility, it's important that we very much agree, talk about mobility. I think one of the things that I understand as a millennial is that one of the reasons why some of these neighborhoods have not been reinvested is because the messaging that we put forth does not speak to that initial piece of Black folks just want to be, and we want to have economic mobility, right? That there is not both a mixture of class, and as we understand in the literature of economic mobility, once you have different classes in the same space, everyone begins sort of to peace. But that should not be confused, rebranded as soft launch gentrification. And that is where I get frustrated, right? Is that people use that to say that the way we value your community is more white middle class yuppies moving in,
Mhm.
right? And so I think that it's important that we hold the culture of the goal of anti-displacement, not just by indirect or direct displacement of property, but think about cultural displacement even of different working class, and have adequate respect. So I think part of the work that we're endeavoring to do, and part of the work that I've been sharing that other folks have been doing, is not only just sort of addressing the crisis today, but thinking about a new Black vision for sustainable communities in the future. And I think that's a really important point that I see the field doing, and that you'll see in some of those examples. So thank you.
Yeah, and let me just say this, Elijah. You're on point. And I want to thank the Network for Development of Conscious Communities for bringing us together. Um, my the, a lot of my thought came from the models of the blacks that I grew up with in a working class, middle class Black community. My father owned a barbershop. So I saw him every day get up and go to his office, a barbershop located at 13th and U Street. Okay. I saw a Black doctor in my neighborhood. Those were my models of success. Uh, uh, the I think we oftentimes, when we talk about the civil rights movement, some of us get caught up on the thing about integration. Well, the last piece of that civil rights movement was economics, economic empowerment, and America has failed to provide, to give us that. That's still a dream that's deferred when it comes to that African American community. All right, and there have been a lot of success stories. I pointed out the Black Broadway here in Washington D.C. Okay, that's what I saw. I saw Black people coming together, meeting together, talking. Why is housing such an asset? Think about it. A third of our income, third, a third, and in some instances, maybe more than just a third, our income goes towards housing, ever increasing. And that has and for any person, man or woman, to go without housing. I mean, where are you gonna put your head? Where are you gonna sleep? You know, I mean, that's trauma right there. If you ever seen anyone evicted, that's trauma that lasts for almost forever. All right, the Black community, working class communities, go through enough trauma as it is. All right, so that's why, and it has an effect. When I say renters, it has an effect on homeowners too, in terms of the value of housing, the ripple effect. All right, along with all the other consumer goods of eating, buying. So yes, housing is a very important item, and in some continents, the international treaties, the United Nations, they make housing a human right. It's a human right. It's only here when you get to the United States, when you get into this dynamic of what are we going to do? There's not enough housing. Well, it costs to build housing because, wood and carpenters, all of that. You're talking about the cost versus, well, we might be able to come out with maybe building 10 houses. We can't certainly give you 30 or 40 because the costs, of building houses outstrip, the creation of housing. And when you put a house out there, now you got all these other players that you got to deal with, brokers, all these other people, all of that. And that's the struggle, and that's the debate that housing activists and developers struggle with every day. What it's going to cost to build a house, and at the end of the day, can I get what I put in as a developer? Can I get the profits? Can I get something? Yes, I want to meet the needs of the community, but at the same time, I've expended thousands, millions of dollars in developing this project. So yes, housing has a ripple effect from a spiritual, from an intellectual, and from a human perspective. I'll let Ryan,
Yeah, Ryan, if you have any closing remarks.
I mentioned earlier in this conversation that we are working with a co-op. And one of the challenges that we're having, the debate that we're having with this co-op is our upfront costs for due diligence to make sure that we can actually secure the financing and accomplish the goals that we have set forth, which is to repair close to $13 million in capital expenditures that this co-op hasn't been able to ascertain. They haven't been able to fund these repairs, these critical repairs to these buildings. And so they're asking us to put forth all of this capital with no guarantee in return. And this is, to Lester's point, very much the debate between private development and the way that it's financed and affordable housing, and how do you bridge that gap? And so, we have made an offer to try and bridge that gap, but that's because we're mission-based, even though we're private development. And the challenge ends up being that you don't find that most of the time in our space. I very much recognize that what my company does is certainly not a solution to the challenge that we all face as it relates to affordable housing or development in Black and brown communities. I do like being part of the solution, though. And I love being part of the conversation, even when that conversation is really, really rough, especially when we are looked at as the gentrifiers that we are. I'm okay being in that space. And I wish more of my development colleagues that look like me were also comfortable being in that space. I think a lot more would get done. I also do believe that most businesses are about finding a solution to a problem and being able to quantify it and capitalize off of it. The fact that there is not financing models that are readily available across the board for the type of affordable housing models that exist, the fact that Elijah's models, as great as they are, have to be so convoluted and so creative in order for them to work, makes them very, very difficult to replicate. And as great as they are, they can't be replicated over and over again, like building townhouses, for example, with private capital. And so if anything comes from this conversation as we continue this, I would love for the financing to be available for those models to expand. Because the only way to solve affordable housing is for there to be a private capital market, a government-based backed affordable housing market, and this creative land trust social enterprise marketplace. It's the only way to solve this thing. And so if anything comes from these type of conversations, I hope it's that solution. And then I will leave you with this. Somebody put in the chat, asked if I was related to SPAC Brothers Pizza in Pittsburgh. And I am ironically not related to them in any way, shape, or form. But there are 5 Ryan SPACs in the entire United States, and 2 of them are in Pennsylvania, and 1 of them owns SPAC Brothers Pizza. So thank you for that little note, and that made me chuckle. So thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you everybody for being a part of this insightful conversation. I think conversations like these are really important. I've added a few links. Elijah's also shared a lot of resources for everyone. He's also shared his contact information. There's the link for the upcoming webinar on February 18th, which is the second part of the Conversations for Black Community Development webinar series. And that added the link to the chat. And then with that, I really want to thank Ryan, Elijah, Lester. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for the work that you do. And we're hoping to stay in contact with all of you. And thank you for being a part of our network.
Just out of curiosity, how do you put your contact information in for the attendees to see?
In the chat, if you could make sure that it says to everyone, or even if you do it to hosts and panelists, I'll share it with everyone.
Awesome. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Get in touch with Lester Cuffy. You can get in touch with me with lestercuffy16@hotmail.com, or you can call me 202-805-1030. Okay. Okay. Thank you, man. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you all for allowing me to participate in this conversation.
No problem.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night. Thank you.
Much honored. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Cuffy is